rocketed from a distant planet to a bold new destiny on Earth. Found by a Kansas family and raised as Clark Kent, he learned he possessed the strength of steel, the speed of light, and the desire to help all mankind. He is Superboy.
Well, welcome, Superboy fans, to the very first episode of the Superboy Legacy Podcast. I am your host, Sam Rizzo, and with me is my co-host, Adam Basciano.
Sam, how are you?
Doing all right, Adam. Doing all right.
We haven't done this in a while, at least for Superboy, anyway.
Yeah, we haven't done this in a while, but it's good to be back, and it's good to be talking about a series that I love and I'm passionate about. You know, the last podcast I did talking about Superboy was back last summer with Cape Wonder, and I had a blast with Jay Towers and Jim Bowers, and we did that great Superboy photo shoot with my costumes and some props, and you know Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
That was a fantastic episode. I just want to say
Yeah, it was.
I love that podcast, and it was great to hear you on there and talking about your love of the show and giving some historical background. It was a really good episode. I liked it.
It was a lot of fun talking about the show and talking about the links between the Superman films with the Superboy series, and you know, I really enjoyed it, and I got the itch to come back and start doing podcasts again. So today, we're going to talk about how we each got into the Superboy series and our fandom with the show. So, you know what, Adam? How did you discover Superboy? How did you get into it?
Well, mine is it's not going to be as extensive as yours, but basically what happened was I recall seeing, you know, an episode here and there when it actually aired. It was so sporadic the way they aired it and what time they aired it and what channel it was on. Like, it was constantly changing, so you could never really, unless you really paid attention to, okay, when is it this way? Like if it was me today watching it for the first time as opposed to however young I was back then, I probably would have been able to track it down and find, you know, what day it was going to be on, what time it was going to be on, and so forth. But as a kid, you just, you know, you kind of got lucky if you turned it on and found it. That's how sporadic it was in the way it was presented here. And I remember seeing, you know, if I saw grand total maybe when I was a kid 10 episodes, that's pretty much, you know, what I had back then. And I remember enjoying it, but you know, at that stage in my, you know, young fandom, it was pretty much, in terms of excuse me, at least DC wise, it was pretty much, you know, mostly Batman back then. But where it really sort of kicked in for me was in talking with you in conjunction with the release of that first season back in was it 2006 when Superman Returns came out?
Yeah, when Superman Returns came out, like that's when pretty much like a lot of the Superboy stuff started coming back around again. Because Warner Brothers was interested in producing that first season set. So
right, yeah, because I remember talking to you and we, you know, obviously we started talking about Superman, and then you had you told me about the show, and I said, yeah, it vaguely sounds familiar. And then the more you told me about it, the more I looked on your webpage and I got more familiar with the series and, you know, the whole history of it and how it went through, you know, two actors playing the role of Superboy and you know, the changeover in season 2 and beyond. So I really became more familiar with it, you know, once I got in contact with you and once we started talking, and then of course because that first season set aired or was released rather, and then subsequent the subsequent seasons were released through Warner Archive, I was able to, fully see the show in its entirety. And I think, I really grew to love and appreciate the place that it has in the history of, like we always say on our other podcasts, as in the tapestry of Superman, that our friend Isaac sort of coined that term. I do really appreciate its place, and I think what I really, really like is the fact that it wears its comic book roots on its sleeve, and it wasn't afraid to be that. And so, I really love when a show just accepts what it is, or a show or a movie, it just embraces its lead character and their mythology and just goes for it. And that's really what the show has. And obviously, it really feels like you're watching a comic book unfold. And I think that it's largely credited to the fact that so many comic book writers that were involved with Superman and Superboy in the books were involved with the show. And I think that only helps.
That's right.
The accuracy and stuff like that. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you had writers like Fred Freiberger that first season. You had Andy Helfer. You had Michael Carlin, Cary Bates. You had a number of comic book writers who really brought their A game to Superboy from the comics.
Yeah. So that's really my exposure in a nutshell. I came to even though I had seen it briefly, I came to the party a little bit late, but. I still enjoyed it and had fun with it nonetheless.
Yeah, you had to listen to me, cry about it all the time. It's such a great show. You got to see it. You got to see it. And thanks to Warner Brothers and Warner Archives, we were able. The show has a second life now on digital streaming and physical media now. So
well, your fandom is positive fandom, Sam. I mean,
yeah,
you didn't run around starting a hashtag, and
release the Snyder Cut. Yes.
Yeah. I've listened to that garbage for I don't know since 2017. Your type of fandom is a breath of fresh air, and I think is how most fandom should behave. I think they could take a lesson to your time in campaigning for the Superboy series. So
thank you, Adam.
Yeah, it's definitely like I said, it's a model to if you're gonna campaign for something, that's the way to do it, folks.
Well, it's all about being professional, being honest, and promoting a positive environment for fans to engage in, and also creating unique and fun content that people can interact with. And we hope to do that with this new Superboy The Legacy podcast. So.
So now you got to tell us about your.
Oh my God! I should write a book, right?
Well, I mean, it's a good idea.
Yeah. Well, my first exposure to Superboy, I was a little late to the party. I first saw the show in 1989 in the summertime, and they were airing the very first Bizarro: The Thing of Steel episode. And I remember clear as day my dad turning on the television to the Channel 50, which was here in Chicago considered the power station. And they would air Superboy episodes back-to-back at 4 p.m. They would sandwich Superboy right between My Secret Identity. Well, first it was an episode of My Secret Identity. Then it was Dracula the series. And then your 2 episodes of Superboy at 4 o'clock. And then your prime time was Swamp Thing and Star Trek: The Next Generation.
That sounds like a fun block of TV if you ask me.
I mean, you sat there for 3 hours and you were totally entertained. So that Saturday, my dad turned on the television, and that was the first episode that really got me into the world of Superman. Seeing Gerard Christopher as Superboy walk into Professor Peterson's lab in the rain and going, "Professor," with his hands on his hips, and you see the lightning behind him, and he walks in the lab. Like, I'll never forget that scene. It's such a great scene, and it's such a Superman scene. Come to find out years later, that scene, that entire scene in and of itself, is from the 1968 Superboy comic Superboy 68, the first appearance of Bizarro. And they just took that entire scene and lifted it and put it right in the show. So they really loved the Silver Age of comic books, of the Superboy books. And you could tell they went and they picked apart different scenes and put it in the show. And that's what I loved about that first Bizarro episode. But yeah, that was the start of my healthy obsession with the series.
Yeah.
And then I caught on with that episode, and I watched every Saturday on the Power Station. And, I learned how to, being 6, 7 years old, I learned how to work the VCR and recorded every episode I could. And as the seasons progressed, as you got into the last season, it was all over the place. They kept changing the time. Like, it would
so basically,
yeah,
what we had throughout its entire run, you had in the last season.
yeah, right. It was just like I remember the last handful of episodes from the last season of Superboy, like it was at 4:00, or it was at 7:00. Then the final 2 episodes, Obituary for a Superhero, they aired at 11:30 at night, and I said to my dad, "Please record it for me." He didn't know how to work the recorder. I was bawling because I didn't think I was ever going to see those episodes. That's how crazy I was for the show. And there was things that my dad did. He wrote into Viacom for me when I was little, and they sent us back Viacom press photos. Like, I still have those 3 photos from the last handful of episodes of Gerard, and I think it was a shot of Sherman Howard with Metallo, Lex and Metallo, from the episode Threesome. Like, I have all this really great stuff that my dad got me when I was a kid.
Yeah.
My favorite memory with the show was Christmas time of '92, and my dad got me the Epilogue magazine for Christmas. And I came down, the stairs, and there was the Epilogue, and it had all these, black and white photos from the show, and the episode guide in there. I was really interested in the photos more than anything, but the episode guide was really cool to have something from the show, because there was hardly anything still to this day. Go ahead.
And I'm sure you still have those, right?
I still have those, and then I picked up a couple more since then. But
I kind of figured that.
But yeah, that was my first exposure to the show. And in '95, I want to say, here in Chicago, they re-aired the first season, because I didn't know there was another actor that played Superboy before Gerard Christopher. I didn't know of John Hames Newton until I saw those rerun first season episodes in '95. So I was like, oh my God, they're bringing back Superboy. This is so great. And the first episode I saw on Fox here in Chicago was the Kryptonite Kills episode. And Superboy is grounding the power line, That was a great scene. 2 great scenes that got me into the Superboy television show was that scene with the Kryptonite and the power lines, him acting all Superboy, trying to ground the power lines and save TJ, and the scene from the Bizarro episode. 2 really great scenes that I'll never forget. So, but yeah, that was my exposure and to Superboy when I was young. And since that time, the show was in this legal limbo. It wasn't in syndication. They didn't release anything from the show. There was, other than the tie-in comic that went along with the series, there was really nothing out there for fans,
right,
for fans of the show. So, and immediately right after Superboy ended, Warner Brothers pretty much ended Superboy to make Lois and Clark. Because Warner's didn't have any slice of the pie when Superboy was being made. It was Viacom, it was the Salkind Productions. So Warner Brothers and DC basically stopped approving their scripts, and that basically cut the show at the knees, even it being in the top 10 in syndication.
Right.
So after the 100 episodes, that was it. and then Warner Brothers started to develop Lois and Clark. So I mean, if you didn't really catch Superboy while it was on the air, you had no knowledge of it. There was no awareness of it. There was no marketing campaign. There was no action figures. There was no posters. Like, you literally had to be in front of your television in order to even know that this show existed.
Right.
So in years after, I would go to conventions here in Chicago looking to get my hands on anything from the show. And people would give you that perplexed look on your face like, don't you mean Lois and Clark? Don't you mean the Superman films? No, I mean The Adventures of Superboy. It ran 100 episodes on television in syndication, and it was a big hit. Especially the last 2 years, it was a big hit. The only time I found stuff was a great store that would travel from the West Coast here to Chicago for conventions called Hollywood Book and Poster. And I'll never forget Hollywood Book and Poster. They had 100 different photos from the show. I bought them all. And since then I found a gentleman who bought that entire collection from the original slides from Hollywood Book and Poster, and I bought those from him. So yeah, my fandom's kind of crazy when it comes to the show, cuz I mean, it was my first love. It got me into the Superman world. It really understood the character. It told stories in 22 minutes, full stories in 22 minutes, that harkened back to the Silver Age of the comics. And, I mean, the writers like Michael Carlin, Cary Bates, Andy Helfer, they had a lot to do with it. They understood the character. They still do to this day. These guys were the best. So, oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh no! Finish that. Yeah.
No. And I have to give a shout out to David Nutter, because this was really one of his first jobs, and he was a director on Superboy. He directed a number of those early episodes in the second season episodes, and he really made the show something great. Julia Pistor, the producer who took over for Elia the last 2 seasons, and basically turned it into the X-Files before the X-Files. It gave it a film noir, a dark look to it, but it still, at its heart, was about a hero, about hope, about a hopeful superhero. And they didn't make Superboy into Batman. They understood who he was.
So you mean he didn't fly around saying no one stays good in this world?
No.
And to my recollection, I could be wrong now. Sam, you're the authority on this, so you'll tell me if I'm right or wrong. But the last I checked, what was it? 88? Was it 88 episodes? I think it was, right.
There was a total of 100 episodes. 4 seasons, 100 episodes.
So in that 100 episode span,
yeah,
I don't believe I ever saw Superboy snap anybody's neck. So
no,
I mean. It's it's nice and it's refreshing. Like I am. How can I phrase this? I really do like Man of Steel. I'm not trying to make fun of the film as a whole. It's just there's just certain things that it does, and then its subsequent sequels, who God help us, do that really aggravate and frustrate me, because I don't think that particular filmmaker understood the character of Superman. And I think what is refreshing about these episodes, you can look back and say they are of their time, and they have, you know what I mean,
right? The
tone and right. the humor, the type of humor, it's of the period. However, what I think, overall fans of both Superboy and the larger Superman world can appreciate is that when you go there, at his core, the character is it's quintessential Superman. And I like that. Yes, he was growing up. He was he was figuring out, how to go about,
right,
being Superboy and doing the right thing.
Mm-hmm.
But again, he always stayed true, and it was never a situation of, dour and
right. He never became mopey. He never became mopey.
Exactly.
He was always,
and that is,
yeah.
It's such a refreshing, palate cleanser. Even going back, that many years, to see that, especially when the last few cinematic takes have focused on, let's either be sadder than all hell, or let's look like a miserable, constipated, superpowered version of Batman. So it's like this is a refreshing palate cleanser if you're disillusioned with the current adaptation.
Well, the great thing about this show is it was basically a loose spin-off of the Chris Reeve films.
Mm-hmm.
It,
Mm-hmm.
it was a hopeful Superboy. The only, I mean, we saw in the later seasons Superboy dealing with death, seeing his aunt die, and
Right.
and accidentally thinking he killed somebody with using his powers, and him going back to Ma and Pa Kent and saying, I don't want to do this anymore. I don't want to be Superboy anymore. I don't want to have people's lives in my hands and let them down.
Right.
So I mean, they had episodes that dealt with that. That was the rebirth episodes from, I think it was season 3.
Sure, but and it's
yeah.
cool to deal with those serious themes and struggles, because naturally he would, because he's still
Right.
figuring out how to do all this. But the point is, he was able to work through that and take a moment of character progression, and move a step forward in his heroism, where the most recent filmed adaptation takes two steps backwards before taking a step forward. So that's the difference. Like, I'm not saying seriousness and a little bit of darkness is not allowed in Superman, because it is, and because it's part of everyday growing up and stuff. It's just, how do you work through that, and how is it executed, and that's the difference. Where, and I think it largely stems to the fact that behind the scenes you had writers and producers that were in the comics industry and really had a vested interest in this character.
Right. And I always look at the Superboy series as embracing and celebrating the Silver Age of comics. I mean, when Superboy gets affected by kryptonite, his skin turns green when he gets close to it. That's right out of the comics with Kurt Swan. Like I mentioned with the first Bizarro episode, that scene with Professor Peterson and the duplication ray, that's right out of the comics. Bizarro kicking a car right through a department store window, that's right out of the comics. So, like, you could tell the writers and the directors of the show really loved the source material and really got who these characters were and didn't try to change them. And it's 22 minutes, but it's funny because I can't tell you how many stories from Superboy have been lifted for, like, Lois and Clark or Smallville. Like, I mean, the only thing up until this day that I love that is carried through each incarnation of Superman we've seen is the Bizarro on Superboy is the best incarnation of Bizarro on film to this day. Honestly.
Oh, hands down, yeah.
Because they nailed it. Other than not making his S backwards, they hit the essence of who that character is. And I loved it. So, and what Douglas Myers did in that role, he was fantastic. So,
he was great. I thought, yeah.
And Rob Berman with the makeup, just amazing work. I mean, just some of the stories that they've told me about developing the character and doing the character's dialogue is just, it's just so cool to be able to talk to them and get information about what the scene was like, or how did you develop this, or how was it putting the makeup on for the first time. It was just really great.
And you know you mentioned, it's a loose kind of spin-off or
yes,
prequel
yes.
to the Christopher Reeve franchise.
Mm-hmm.
Like in my headcanon, which it's my headcanon, so who's going to tell me I'm wrong? I kind of look at it like in the 12 in the 12 years that the movie says he was in with Jor-El, I could sort of rework that in my head and say, well, in those 12 years, he went back to Smallville and was Superboy, and that's where the show sort of takes its space.
Right. Like,
so that's my headcanon.
Like
and
I like the headcanon. Your headcanon is right. Like the scene we see where with Jeff East and Glenn Ford on the farm when Pa Kent says to young Clark, you know what, you are here for a reason. And I've always thought in my head, like, that's where the Superboy series starts.
Yeah.
It was that scene.
Yeah, because that's when he goes, because then in the movie, Jonathan dies and then he goes to the fortress. So in that, yeah.
Right. But it was funny because Superboy didn't have a fortress, but he sort of had a quasi-fortress where he kept all his little, like, trophies or little weapons that he used. So it was kind of a makeshift fortress, and we saw it in the Abandoned Earth episodes, an Escape to Earth two-parter in season 2, which was really cool. So,
because when I you know, I think I've told you this story, and I think I've told it on my other podcast, where, you know, I first came to the Superman movies, like I had seen them on TV randomly and whatever.
Yeah.
But I never sat through them entirely until 2002 when Smallville was premiering, because I would always see the advertisement, you know, the commercials for Smallville.
Mm-hmm.
And those advertisements back in the day was essentially Tom Welling sitting in the town cafe in the director's chair, and he kept saying, "Come watch my show Smallville starting whenever whatever Tuesday, whenever it aired."
Yeah.
I think Tuesday at 9:00. But sad that I remember that, but there it is. And, you know, they would always air, like, they'd air it, you know, when you get those commercials that literally 30 seconds after you've seen it,
yeah,
it's back again.
Right.
And they would always air it during the time when I'm trying to watch hockey. So I would get, at that point, I was getting upset. I was thinking, you know, like, I don't care what the show is, put the game back on. But then as I'm watching the game, I'm thinking to myself, wait a minute, Smallville, that sounds familiar.
Yeah.
And then I would think, oh, that's Superman. So that made me want to watch the show. And then I watched the show and I'm like, let me go back and watch the movies, because at that point those were the movies that were around. There was no Superman Returns. There was nothing else. Mm-hmm. So I had finally watched the movies full stop in 2002. And as I was watching that first movie and seeing, you know, Christopher Reeve in the costume, I had a memory of the Superboy series and seeing what I had assumed was the exact same costume. And so for the longest time, until I met you and I sort of got a lowdown on what the series actually was, I had thought, okay, that must have been a prequel series that went right into then the films kind of, you know. So up until a certain time, that's what I thought it was. So in my head canon, it still is that.
It was right. It was right, yeah.
It still is that. So there it is. It's just...
But so with this new Superboy Legacy podcast, what I want to accomplish is what we're doing now, embracing our fandom, talking about our fandom, inviting guests on that had things to do with the show, some of the actors, some of the cast and crew, and just getting their stories of what it was like to be in the role of Bizarro, or in the role of Lex Luthor, or, you know, being up on the wires as Superboy. Like, that's what I want to accomplish with this new podcast, and hopefully you guys will come with us on this journey into discovering more and more and learning about the production that was the Adventures of Superboy TV series. So
that sounds great to me. I'm looking forward to it. Looking forward to talking about the episodes and interviewing a lot of guests. And I'm especially excited. Hopefully, we get to cover the tie-in comics.
Oh, definitely.
And so, yeah, it's going to be a fun time, and I hope that the listeners are excited as we are and agree to take flight with us.
Well, thank you, Adam, for joining me on this very first episode. Thank you to all that have listened, and don't forget to subscribe on Facebook and Instagram at Superboy Legacy for exclusive content like photos, videos, brand new interviews, the podcast. So go subscribe. And for the Superboy Legacy, this is Sam Rizzo and Adam Basciano. And thank you guys again for listening to episode 1.
So long, everybody.
So long, everybody.